As we continue today in looking at the government established by the United States Constitution, we start by looking at the branch of government discussed first and at greatest length in Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. Article 1, of course, covers Congress or the legislative branch. Remember that our Congress, due to the Great Compromise, was established as a bicameral legislature, which means that our legislative branch is made up of two houses. You probably already know the names of these two houses, and they are, of course, the U.S. House of Representatives, and here is a new piece of information. It is made up of 435 voting members. And additionally, there is the U.S. Senate, which is made up of 100 voting members. And as we've seen, their primary job is to make laws. Whether those laws prohibit a behavior and establish a punishment for having disregarded the law, or the law passed by Congress authorizes the spending of some government money, say to purchase aircraft to bolster our Air Force, it's Congress, not the president, who creates or makes those laws. We will eventually look at this lawmaking process in more detail, but for today, understand that it is the responsibility of Congress, made up of the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, to make this nation's laws. If you were to read Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, which I don't recommend unless you're attempting to induce sleep, but if you read Article 1, whose focus is Congress, you can see all the powers granted to Congress via the Constitution. In fact, if you look at Article 1, Section 8, you'd find 18 powers granted specifically to Congress. These include powers like taxation. So it's Congress, not the president, who determines what taxes American citizens and businesses will be compelled to pay. And while taxation falls to Congress, we will see how the president can influence Congress in their exercising of this particular power. It is also up to Congress when it comes to the federal government borrowing money. So when we look at a national debt and how we got there, sure, it's easy to point a finger at a single individual, say a president, and blame them for our ever-growing national debt. However, the informed student of government knows that the blame can't be laid solely at the president's feet. Instead, a more informed student of government would know our national debt did not grow to its current levels without Congress contributing significantly to the problem. It's also up to Congress to establish our military forces. Surprising to many is the fact that Congress is the branch of our federal government vested with the power to declare war. The Founding Fathers felt very strongly about not giving this power to a single individual, say like a president, and instead felt that such a grave and serious decision like declaring war should instead be made by Congress, who, due to their larger numbers and answerability to those they might represent, Congress might more thoroughly vet a serious move like declaring war as compared to a single person like a president having to make such a decision. So Congress has the power to declare war. The entire list of Congress's expressed powers, powers specifically granted to them by the Constitution, can be found in Chapter 5, Lesson 2. Before moving on from congressional powers, I want to spend a moment looking at what might be Congress's greatest power, which is described in the Necessary and Proper Clause of Article 1, Section 8. As you can see, this part of the Constitution grants Congress the power to make all laws necessary and proper to carry out their duties. But what does that mean? What is necessary and proper to you might not be necessary and proper to me, and vice versa. So this clause in the Constitution is intentionally vague and not very specific. What this clause does is grant Congress the ability to stretch their powers to address situations that might not be specifically mentioned in the Constitution. This is why the clause is sometimes referred to as the elastic clause. Now, despite the vague nature of this clause that grants Congress the ability to stretch their powers, understand that just like the elastic band keeping your knickers up, this clause has limitations. The elastic clause allows Congress to stretch their powers, but it should not be considered a blank check to do whatever they want, because that was a scenario the Founding Fathers went to great lengths to try to avoid. Remember that when Congress takes action or exercises its powers, there are two other branches constantly watching what they are doing. So if Congress were to say take questionable action and point to the necessary and proper clause as justification, you might still have, say, the Supreme Court step in and interpret Congress's actions as unconstitutional. Despite Congress claiming an action as necessary and proper, the Supreme Court could rule Congress's actions as unconstitutional and throw out their necessary and proper justification and rule they stop doing whatever it is they've done. Because after all, it is the Supreme Court's job to interpret the law and what it means, and that would definitely apply to the necessary and proper clause. So the necessary and proper clause does allow Congress some room to take action in a way perhaps not specified in the Constitution, but understand that there are limitations and safeguards within the Constitution that attempt to prevent abuse of such a privilege. Just like the elastic band in your underoos can only stretch so far before resulting in the uncomfortable scenario of a flaccid pair of underpants, have fun trying to walk around and look cool with a broken elastic band in your underbritches, so too does the necessary and proper clause have its limits. Looking at congressional terms, we see that the first Congress met in 1789 after the ratification or formal approval of the U.S. Constitution and the holding of the first national elections. This first Congress that met in 1789 wished to distinguish themselves from all the other meetings of Congress that would inevitably follow. In that way, they could be remembered and celebrated for all that they as a Congress had accomplished. So they called themselves the First Congress. Remember, this is government, so I hope you weren't expecting some creative name, because in government, that kind of thinking is not encouraged. Now, because elections are held every 2 years, because as you'll learn, members of the House of Representatives get 2-year terms, so in 1791, a new Congress met following the second ever national election. This new Congress certainly contained many of the same members as the first Congress, yet there were some new faces. So, in not being the exact same group, they too named themselves. And once again, creativity and fun are not allowed in government, so they called themselves the Second Congress. This process has continued every year, so that as of November 2020, we are currently being governed by the 116th Congress. However, come January 2021, the winners of the 2020 election will be sworn in, and then we will have the 117th Congress for the next 2 years. Therefore, every 2-year cycle in which a new group of Congress is seated is known as a term. Each term consists of 2 year-long meetings known as a session. So one term is made up of 2 sessions. These sessions begin in January and end in December. So the first of two sessions begins in January of an odd numbered year. So elections are held in November of even numbered years. And the second and final session begins in January of an even numbered year. Given that it is November of 2020, what session is our current 116th Congress currently in? Correcto. Our current 116th Congress is in their second and final session. And come January 2021, the new 117th Congress will begin its first session. Congress is financially compensated for the work they do. Salaries for members of the House of Representatives and the Senate are currently $174,000 a year. And remember, the average American makes about $40,000 a year. Surprising to many is the fact that Congress sets their own salary. So yes, today Congress could vote themselves million-dollar pay raises. So let's look at why they don't. The most recent amendment added to the U.S. Constitution was added back in the 1990s and addressed this idea of Congress and their ability to set their own salary. The 27th Amendment addresses congressional pay raises. The 27th Amendment left Congress with the ability to set their own salary. However, any pay raises they vote themselves don't take effect until after the next election. So, if the 116th Congress were to vote themselves million-dollar pay raises, those raises wouldn't take effect until after the 117th Congress was sworn in. How does this solve the problem of Congress having the ability to vote themselves million-dollar pay raises? Well, this allows voters to weigh in on any raises Congress votes for themselves. If the 116th Congress voted themselves million-dollar pay raises, there would be no shortage of displeased Americans, people who themselves may be struggling, unemployed, underemployed, they themselves without a raise for extended periods of time. These unhappy Americans might have very strong opinions about a group of lawmakers taking their tax dollars and spending it on lavish raises for themselves. As a result, many of these Americans may circle the upcoming election on their calendar with the mindset of voting against any and all members of Congress who voted themselves these million-dollar pay raises. So, in effect, the people who voted themselves these million-dollar pay raises never actually see the raise because they lose their position in Congress before the raise actually takes place. So the 27th Amendment does not prohibit Congress from granting themselves exorbitant raises, but they do need to think about how the voting public might react before voting yes on any raise. Aside from financial compensation, members of Congress also receive other perks. They get an office in the Capitol building, which you can see before you. The more senior or the longer you've been in Congress, the nicer the office. In fact, due to the shortage of space in the actual Capitol building you see before you, freshman congressmen and women, the noobs, actually have offices in a building just adjacent to the Capitol building. Members of Congress also have a budget to round out their staff. These people, the staff, do a lot of the actual reading of proposed bills and laws and provide the broad strokes or cliff notes for the members of Congress for whom they work. They are also afforded a number of free trips home, as most have to live in Washington, D.C. full-time. These trips home, yes, allow them to see their families if their families did not move with them to D.C., but it also allows members of Congress to meet face-to-face with their constituents or the people whom they represent. Members of Congress also have congressional immunity while conducting government business. this does not extend to felonies. This was meant to prevent someone from detaining members of Congress so that they might disrupt a potential vote on an upcoming piece of legislation. This was not meant as a get-out-of-jail-free card. Sure, there are stories of members of Congress abusing this power. One famous story involves a senator by the name of Robert Byrd, who one afternoon on his way to the Capitol building to conduct congressional business rear-ended a van at such a high rate of speed that it took a tow truck over an hour to pry the two vehicles apart. And when the officer on the scene began to write a citation for Senator Robert Byrd, the senator reached into his front pocket and pulled out a pocket copy of the Constitution and pointed to the portion regarding congressional immunity. At that point, Senator Byrd left the scene of the accident without citation. That obviously is not the intention of the congressional immunity. But again, there's intention and then there's reality. Lastly, for us, Congress does also get free mailing privileges. This is a holdover from a time when the mail was the only way for members of Congress to communicate with the voters back in their home states. Without government picking up the cost of congressional mailings, it might have been very costly to be a member of Congress. So even though there are today a multitude of ways to communicate with your congressman or congresswoman, the franking privilege remains. Now, if you are a member of Congress and you're caught doing something naughty, there is a way in which those actions can be addressed. The first manner of addressing congressional misdeeds is censure. Censure is the least serious form of rebuke or punishment, as basically you, as the offending member of Congress, are called out in front of the rest of Congress and they formally disapprove of your actions. Tisk, tisk, for shame. So you are publicly shamed. This is basically a slap on the wrist. Understand that you don't want to be censured, but it's not the end of your career. Nor is it something to be proud of. It's not like you have members of Congress who've been censured multiple times, and when they walk by the other members of Congress, they whisper things like, "There goes Senator Howlett. He's such a bad mamma jamma. He's been censured like 7 times, and he just doesn't give a shut your mouth." It's not like there are bad boy senators who take censure as a badge of honor. If you are censured, be confident that whoever is running against you will bring it up as a reason to not re-elect you. The more serious way of disciplining a member of Congress is expulsion. And this is exactly what you think it is. This sees the offending member of Congress kicked out of Congress by the other members of Congress. So if you do something so naughty they can't just slap your wrist, they may have to expel one of their own so that others don't think such repugnant behavior is considered acceptable. Otherwise, the stink may waft onto the other so-called honest senators and members of Congress. This doesn't happen very often. The last occurrence was way back in 2002. And in 2002, this finally two-paid member of Congress, Jim Traficant, was expelled from Congress for essentially taking bribes to vote yes on certain laws. This is against the law. So not only was Mr. Traficant kicked out of Congress, he was also prosecuted for his crime, convicted, and sentenced to jail. Showing no shame, he ran for re-election from his jail cell. He lost. Upon release, he was riding his tractor when it flipped over, pinning and killing Jim Traficant. Moment of silence for Jim Traficant. Thank you very much.